93%. That is how many of my patients over 60 were unknowingly working against their own brain every single night. Not because they were careless, not because they ignored their health, because nobody, not their primary care doctor, not their cardiologist, not a single specialist along the way, ever stopped and asked them one simple question: what do you eat for dinner? My name is Dr. Marcus Webb. I have spent 28 years as a neurologist, and the last 14 of those focused specifically on cognitive decline and brain aging in adults over 55. I have sat across from hundreds of patients who came in frightened because they forgot their grandkids' names or blanked on a word mid-sentence or woke up feeling like their mind was wrapped in wet cotton. And almost every single time, the conversation nobody had with them before me was about what happens inside the brain after the kitchen light goes off. Here's what I want you to understand before we go any further. Your brain does not rest when you sleep. It runs the most critical maintenance cycle of the entire day. Think of it like this: every night your brain is trying to run a deep clean cycle, the kind that actually clears out the debris that builds up from a full day of thinking, reacting, and remembering. But that cycle needs the right fuel loaded in before it starts. Most people over 60 are running it on fumes, and they have absolutely no idea. Today, I'm going to walk you through three things. First, what is actually happening inside your brain while you sleep and why it becomes so critical after 60. Second, 5 specific, everyday foods that directly support that process and why timing matters just as much as the food itself. Third, what one of my patients did differently that gave him back something he genuinely thought was gone forever. Before we get into it, I want to ask you something, and I mean this seriously. When you wake up in the morning, does your mind feel sharp right away, or does it take a good hour just to feel like yourself? Hold that answer, because by the end of this video, you will understand exactly what that feeling is telling you. Let us start with what is going on inside your skull tonight. Before I talk about any food, you need to understand what your brain is actually doing at 2 in the morning. Because once you see this clearly, everything else will click into place. In 2013, a team at the University of Rochester published a finding that genuinely shook the neuroscience world. They discovered that the brain has its own dedicated waste removal system completely separate from anything in the rest of the body. They called it the glymphatic system, and it works almost exclusively during deep sleep. Here's how I explain it to my patients. You know how your dishwasher runs a heavy cycle at night, the kind where it heats the water, scrubs the dishes, and flushes out the drain? Your brain does the exact same thing. Cerebrospinal fluid pulses through specific channels in the brain tissue, flushing out the metabolic waste that built up all day from normal thinking and activity. The key word there is flush. This is an active, forceful process, not passive, not slow. It requires the brain to be in deep sleep, and it requires the right biological environment to run efficiently. Now here's where it gets serious. One of the primary things this system clears out every night is a protein called beta-amyloid. You may have heard that name in the context of Alzheimer's disease, and for good reason. In a brain that sleeps deeply and has the right nutritional support, beta-amyloid gets flushed out consistently night after night. But when sleep is poor, or when the brain is missing specific nutrients, that clearance slows down, and beta-amyloid begins to accumulate. A landmark study out of UC Berkeley found that just one night of poor sleep increased beta-amyloid accumulation in the hippocampus, the brain's primary memory center, by 5%. One night. Now multiply that across months and years of slightly disrupted sleep, and you begin to understand how cognitive decline can build silently for a decade before anyone notices a single symptom. This is exactly what happened to Margaret. She was 67 years old when she came into my office. Retired school principal. Sharp her entire life, the kind of woman who remembered every student's name, every parent's face, decades of details. She came in because at her school reunion, she blanked on the name of a student she had mentored for 3 years. She described it as a wall coming down in her mind. Just nothing there. Her MRI looked clean. Blood work was fine. Blood pressure controlled. Her previous doctor had told her it was just normal aging. I asked her what she had for dinner the night before. She paused. Pasta, she said, with a side salad, maybe some crackers and cheese before bed. That was the conversation that changed everything for her. Not because pasta is poison, but because her brain every single night was being sent into its most critical maintenance window without the specific nutrients it needed to do the job. Her dishwasher was running, but she had forgotten to add the detergent for years. Now, here is something I need to say clearly, because it directly affects how effective everything we are about to discuss will actually be for you. There is a food that almost half my patients over 60 were eating for dinner every night that was actively working against everything we just discussed. Not because it is unhealthy in general, but because of what it does to brain chemistry in the 4 hours before sleep specifically. Refined carbohydrates eaten late in the evening after 8 o'clock spike insulin, suppress melatonin efficiency, and raise inflammatory markers in the brain by the time deep sleep should be starting. Margaret's pasta dinner. That is exactly what I am talking about. It is not the pasta itself. It is the timing and the absence of anything to counterbalance it. Keep that in mind as we go through the 5 foods, because what you replace that habit with is where the real shift begins. So what does the right fuel actually look like? That is exactly what we are getting into right now. I am going to say something that surprises almost every patient I say it to in the exam room. One of the most powerful brain protective foods you can eat tonight costs less than $2. It is not exotic. It is not trendy. It has been sitting in the grocery store aisle your entire life, largely ignored. Sardines. I know. Stay with me. Sardines are loaded with 2 omega, 3 fatty acids, DHA, and EPA. Now, I could give you the biochemistry lecture, but let me give you the version that actually sticks. DHA makes up a significant portion of your brain cell membranes. These membranes are not just walls, they are the signal pathways that allow neurons to communicate with each other. Think of them like the fiber optic cables running under a city. When DHA levels are adequate, signals travel fast and clean. When DHA is low, those cables start to stiffen. Information slows, connections degrade. And during deep sleep, when the brain is trying to do precision repair work on these connections, a stiff, inflexible membrane is the equivalent of trying to do surgery with heavy winter gloves on. The Framingham Heart Study, one of the longest-running cardiovascular studies in American history, found that people with the highest DHA levels in their blood had a 47% lower risk of developing dementia compared to those with the lowest levels. 47%. That is not a marginal difference. That is a completely different trajectory for your brain. And sardines, specifically because they are small, low on the food chain, contain almost no mercury. This means you can eat them 2 to 3 times a week without any concern. That consistency is what actually moves the needle. Now I hear the objection coming. You do not like sardines. Half my patients say the same thing in the first 5 minutes. So here is what I actually tell them. Try the smoked variety, the flavor is completely different. Mix them into pasta with olive oil and capers. Mash them onto whole grain toast with a squeeze of lemon and a little Dijon. The goal is not to eat something you hate. The goal is to find one way you can be consistent. Because 1 can of sardines 3 times a week is worth more than a premium fish oil supplement that sits forgotten in your cabinet. Structure handled. Now let us talk about getting blood to that structure. This is where avocado comes in, and not for the reason most people assume. Avocados contain healthy monounsaturated fats, yes. But the reason they belong on this list specifically is their folate content. Folate drives a process called methylation, which controls how neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine are produced. I describe methylation to my patients like this. Imagine folate as the traffic control system for your brain's chemistry. Without it running properly, signals pile up, get rerouted incorrectly, or simply do not go through. Mood becomes unstable. Sleep becomes shallow. Memory consolidation, the process that happens during deep sleep, where your brain actually files away what you learned that day, starts to break down. There is also the blood flow piece. The monounsaturated fats in avocado support healthier, more flexible blood vessels. Your brain consumes roughly 20% of your body's total oxygen, despite being only about 2% of your body weight. Any reduction in blood flow, even minor, forces your brain to operate below capacity. Half an avocado at dinner is enough to meaningfully support circulation during the overnight repair window. Here is something I started doing myself about 6 years ago. I keep avocados on the counter and sardines in the pantry the way most Americans keep bread and peanut butter. That shift alone, just making these the default, changed my evening routine without any extra effort. Now, before we move to the third food, I want to pause on something that most people never consider, and it is the detail that quietly determines how effective all 5 of these foods will actually be for your brain. It is not just about what you eat. It is about when those nutrients arrive in your bloodstream relative to when your brain starts its maintenance cycle. The glymphatic system reaches peak activity during the early deep sleep window, typically somewhere between 1 and 3 hours after you fall asleep. For most people, that lands between 11 at night and 2 in the morning, which means the nutrients your brain needs for that cycle need to be available in circulation by the time it starts. And that means eating them 2 to 3 hours before sleep, not at midnight, not in a rushed dinner at 9, but ideally between 6 and 7:30 in the evening. Think of it like fueling a long-haul flight. You do not top off the tanks at 30,000 feet. You do it on the ground before the engines are running at full load. Your brain's maintenance cycle is that flight. Dinner is the fuel stop. The timing determines whether you arrive at deep sleep with full tanks or running low. Keep that in mind as we go through the final three foods. If this is making sense to you, do me a favor, hit the like button right now. It tells me this kind of practical, no hype information is actually useful. And if you know someone in their 60s or 70s who needs to hear this, share it with them. This is the conversation most doctors simply do not have time to have in a 15-minute appointment. Now, we have covered structure and blood flow, but there is a third element that almost nobody talks about, and it may be the reason you feel mentally exhausted by noon, even after a full night's sleep. Have you ever noticed that your mind feels sharpest in the morning? Maybe the first hour after you get up, and then it starts losing steam well before lunch. You did not sleep badly. You are not sick, but something is just draining. That pattern has a name, and it is not laziness. It is mitochondrial inefficiency. Every single brain cell runs on energy produced by tiny structures called mitochondria. When you are young, these structures work like a clean, well-maintained power grid. But after 62 things happen. First, the mitochondria themselves start to become less efficient. Second, damaged mitochondria accumulate inside cells because the body's system for removing and replacing them, a process scientists call mitophagy, slows down significantly. The result is what I describe to my patients as a generator problem. Imagine a backup generator that used to power your whole house running flawlessly. Now picture that same generator, older, not well maintained, running alongside three other broken generators that nobody has gotten around to removing. The working one is using a huge amount of its output just to compensate for the drag created by the others. Your cells end up the same way. Enormous energy being wasted just managing the inefficiency. This is where walnuts enter the conversation in a way most people never expect. Walnuts contain a combination of polyphenols and alpha-linolenic acid, a plant-based omega-3 that research has shown to support mitophagy. They essentially help the cell's internal cleanup crew identify and remove the damaged mitochondria so healthy ones can take over. The result is more efficient energy production, less oxidative stress, and a brain that wakes up with more actual capacity to do the repair work it was trying to do all night. A 2020 study, published in the Journal of Nutrition, Health and Aging, found that adults over 60 who consumed walnuts regularly showed measurably higher processing speed and better working memory scores compared to those who did not. Not decades of eating walnuts, regular consumption, consistency over time. The dose is simple: 1 ounce. That is roughly 7 whole walnuts, about a small handful. You do not need a bag of trail mix. You do not need walnut oil or walnut supplements. 7 walnuts at dinner. That is it. I had a patient, Robert, 71, retired engineer from Cleveland, who came in for what he thought was early depression. He was not sad. He was just mentally exhausted by 11 in the morning every single day for 2 years. We ruled out thyroid. We ruled out sleep apnea. His labs were textbook normal. I asked him to make one change before our next appointment. Add walnuts and one other food from this list to his dinner 4 nights a week. 8 weeks later, he called my office before his scheduled visit. He said, and I'm quoting him directly, "Doc, I do not know what you did, but I feel like I got my afternoons back." What would you do with your afternoons back? Because that is genuinely what we are talking about here. Here is the moment in this video where I need you to pay close attention. Because everything we have talked about, the glymphatic cleaning cycle, the DHA for membrane integrity, the mitochondrial energy, all of it depends on one thing that is almost entirely determined by what you eat at dinner. Deep sleep. Not just sleep. Deep sleep. Stage 3. NREM sleep. Specifically, the stage where the glymphatic system becomes most active, where beta-amyloid clearance peaks, where memory consolidation actually happens. Without sufficient time in that stage, the other foods on this list are doing roughly half the job they could be doing. And here is the brutal truth about Americans over 60. According to the National Sleep Foundation, adults in this age group spend significantly less time in deep sleep than younger adults. Some studies suggesting as little as 5 to 8% of total sleep time in deep sleep compared to 13 to 23% in younger adults. That is not just a sleep problem. That is a brain maintenance problem. Magnesium is one of the most under-discussed nutrients in brain health, and cooked spinach is one of the most efficient ways to get it. Here is how I explain magnesium to patients who have never thought about it before. Your nervous system has a natural volume dial. It can run loud, running high-frequency brain activity, or it can turn down to allow the brain to descend into deep sleep. Magnesium is the mechanism that turns that dial. Specifically, it activates GABA receptors, the brain's primary inhibitory system, which signals the transition from light to deep sleep. Without adequate magnesium, your brain essentially cannot find the dial. It stays in a lighter, noisier state all night. Here is the number that stopped me cold when I first read it. The National Institutes of Health estimates that over 68% of Americans do not consume adequate magnesium. And for adults over 60, the situation is compounded because even when magnesium is consumed, absorption in the gut decreases naturally with age. Let me put that differently. More than 2 out of every 3 people watching this video right now may be deficient in the one mineral that determines whether your brain actually reaches the sleep depth it needs to clean itself. That is not a fringe issue. That is a public health blind spot. Spinach also contains nitrates, which the body converts to nitric oxide, a compound that relaxes and widens blood vessels, improving cerebral circulation during the repair window. It contains vitamin K, which supports myelin formation, the protective sheath around nerve fibers. And it contains vitamin E, which acts as an antioxidant shield for brain cell membranes during the metabolic stress of overnight repair. One important practical note: cook your spinach. Lightly sautéed in olive oil, even just 3 to 4 minutes, significantly reduces the oxalate content that can interfere with mineral absorption. A generous cup of cooked spinach at dinner delivers more bioavailable magnesium than 3 cups eaten raw. I started recommending this to patients almost a decade ago, mostly because the evidence was too consistent to ignore. What surprised me was how many of them came back and said their sleep had noticeably changed within 2 weeks. Not dramatically, but that groggy, unrestored feeling in the morning was lighter. They described it as the difference between sleeping and actually resting. That difference at the biological level is the difference between a brain that is running the full maintenance cycle and one that is skimming the surface. One more food to go, and this one does something none of the others can do alone. There is a slow-burning fire happening inside the brains of most people over 60. You cannot feel it. There is no pain signal, no obvious warning, but it is quietly interfering with nearly every repair process we have discussed in this video. It is called neuroinflammation, chronic low-grade inflammation inside the brain itself. Here is the mechanism. Your brain has its own immune cells called microglia. In a healthy, well-nourished brain, microglia function like a well-trained first responder team. They identify damage, respond precisely, and stand down when the threat is resolved. But in an aging brain with inadequate omega-3 support, these same cells become overactivated. They start releasing inflammatory compounds even when there is no real threat. And those compounds damage the very tissue microglia are supposed to protect. I describe it to patients like this. Imagine your neighborhood watch program suddenly deciding that every car driving past is suspicious. Instead of keeping things safe, they start creating chaos. That is overactivated microglia. Good intentions, destructive outcomes. And it runs silently every night without a single obvious symptom. Mackerel is exceptionally concentrated in DHA and EPA, significantly higher levels per serving than sardines. These omega-3 fatty acids directly suppress the inflammatory signaling pathways that drive microglial overactivation. Research published in the Journal of Neuroinflammation has demonstrated that regular omega-3 intake reduces key inflammatory markers in the brain's resident immune cells in as little as 6 weeks of consistent consumption. But there is a second mechanism that makes mackerel especially important, and most people have never heard of it. Omega-3 fatty acids, particularly DHA, support the production of a compound called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Think of BDNF as fertilizer for your neural connections. It promotes the growth of new synapses, strengthens existing connections, and supports the brain's capacity to adapt, what neuroscientists call neuroplasticity. In practical terms, it is the biological reason some people in their 70s remain mentally sharp while others do not. Higher BDNF is consistently associated with better memory, faster processing, and more resilient cognitive function as we age. Regular intake of mackerel once or twice a week, alternating with sardines, creates a reliable supply of these essential fats. The key is alternating, not stacking. The goal is consistent frequency over time, not maximum dose at once. Here is something I want you to sit with for a moment. 5 foods: sardines, avocado, walnuts, spinach, mackerel. None of them require a prescription. None of them cost more than what most people spend on a single takeout meal. And together they address the exact biological vulnerabilities that make cognitive decline so common after 60. What would it take for that to become normal dinner conversation? Now let me bring this home with David, because his story is the clearest example I have seen of what actually happens when someone puts all of this together, not perfectly, not dramatically, just consistently. David was 74 years old when he came to see me, retired contractor from Phoenix, physically healthy, still active. He came in because he had forgotten his son's cell phone number, a number he had dialed hundreds of times over 30 years. He stood in his driveway, phone in hand, and it was just gone. He told me that in that moment, standing in the Arizona sun, unable to remember his own son's number, he genuinely felt afraid of himself. We ran the full workup, nothing alarming on imaging, but his diet history told a clear story. Dinners heavy in refined carbohydrates, almost no fatty fish, very little green vegetables, typically eaten at 8:30 or 9 at night after evening TV. I asked him to make one commitment, not a diet overhaul. One commitment, 4 dinners a week with at least 2 of these 5 foods, finished by 7:15. That was it. 6 months later, he did not come back, with a dramatic transformation story. What he said was quieter than that, and I think it was more true because of it. He said his mind felt steady again. Not superhuman, just steady. Like the ground under his thinking had stopped shifting. He had also, without being asked, started teaching his grandson how to build things in his workshop again, something he had quietly stopped doing the year before because he kept losing his train of thought mid-instruction. He got that back. Not from a medication, not from a clinical intervention, from dinner. So here is how I actually apply this with patients. 3 levels depending on where you are starting. If you are just beginning, aim for 2 of these 5 foods at dinner 3 nights a week before 7:30. That is the baseline. It is sustainable, it is not overwhelming, and it starts building the pattern your brain responds to. If you are at an intermediate stage, already eating reasonably well, aim for 3 of these 5 foods at dinner 5 nights a week. Rotate the proteins. Sardines one night, mackerel another. Keep spinach consistent. Add avocado or walnuts as your supporting cast. If you want to go deep, the goal is 4 to 5 of these foods in your dinner rotation, 6 nights a week with dinner consistently ending by 7:30. You will start noticing changes in morning clarity within 3 to 4 weeks. I will tell you something I tell every patient who asks if I follow my own advice. I do not do this perfectly every night. Some nights it is a late call and dinner at 8:30. Some nights it is whatever is quickest in the refrigerator. But I aim for 5 out of 7 nights, and that is enough. Consistency is the mechanism. Perfection is not the goal, it is actually the enemy of the goal because it makes people quit when they miss a day. One safety note before we close. If you are managing kidney disease, are on blood thinners, or have a diagnosed condition that affects how you process nutrients, please check with your physician before making significant dietary changes. These foods are safe for the vast majority of healthy adults, but individual medical situations always take priority over general recommendations. I want to say this clearly because I mean it. Your brain is not failing you. It is responding to what it has been given, and you now know what it actually needs. You are not at the mercy of your age. The choices you make at your dinner table tonight directly determine what your brain has available to work with at 2 in the morning. That is not a metaphor. That is physiology. Tell me in the comments which of these 5 foods are you starting with tonight. I read every comment and I would genuinely like to know. Next week, I'm going to cover the 3 things most people do in the hour before bed that actively undo everything we talked about today. If that sounds relevant to you, make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss it. A quick note before you go, everything in this video is for general educational purposes. It is not a substitute for personal medical advice. If you have chronic health conditions or are on medication, please speak with your doctor before making significant changes to your diet. And either way, regular checkups matter. Please do not skip them. Your brain is not declining. It is waiting.